Beneath the shifting sands of Egypt, where the desert wind hums its eternal song, there lies a valley carved from silence and stone. For centuries, the Valley of the Kings has kept its secrets buried, its tombs hidden beneath the weight of time, its pharaohs resting in uneasy sleep. But among these eternal guardians of the dead, one name would rise above all others. Tutankhamun, the boy king, the forgotten ruler, the sealed enigma of an age long gone. When his tomb was opened, the world held its breath, treasures glittered in the torchlight, and whispers began to creep into the air. Whispers of a curse said to reach across death itself, claiming those who disturbed the slumber of the pharaoh. Yet was it truly vengeance from beyond the grave, or the imagination of a fearful world eager for mystery? Tonight, we journey together into sand and shadow, into history and legend, into the very heart of the curse of Tutankhamun's tomb. The Silent Valley. The desert is not empty. Though at first glance it seems a barren expanse of golden sand stretching endlessly into the horizon, to stand within the Valley of the Kings is to feel the weight of history pressing down on the silence. The air is hot, yes, but it is also strangely still, like a great breath that has been held for thousands of years. The cliffs rise in jagged walls, pale limestone catching the glare of the sun, forming natural guardians around a sacred place that once knew only the passage of kings and priests. Beneath this rock and sand, cut deep into the earth, lie the tombs of Pharaoh's hidden chambers, filled with paintings, inscriptions, treasures, and prayers meant to carry a ruler into eternity. For countless generations, locals and wanderers whispered that this valley was unlike any other. It was said that to walk between these cliffs was to walk on holy ground, a place where the spirits of the departed still stirred, where the sun god Ra himself set each night to descend into the underworld. Each grain of sand might cover a secret door. Each hollow in the rock might conceal a path into the afterlife. But by the late 19th and early 20th century, much of this sanctity had been disturbed. Tomb after tomb had been plundered, treasures looted by robbers or claimed by archaeologists who carried them far from their resting place. Many believed that the valley had been exhausted, that no hidden wonders remained. And yet, hidden beneath the sand and stone, untouched by thieves, there lay one tomb that time itself had forgotten. The tomb of a boy king whose reign had been brief, but whose afterlife would prove eternal. The valley itself, in those days before its discovery, had an atmosphere that was almost otherworldly. Imagine standing at dawn, as the first light spills over the cliffs, painting the rocks in soft hues of rose and gold. The air is cool for only a moment before the heat begins to creep in. The silence is broken only by the faint chirp of desert birds, or the distant bray of a donkey belonging to workers in the nearby villages. The sand crunches beneath your feet, each step a reminder that you walk upon a necropolis. A city not of the living, but of the dead. And in this silence, a strange feeling comes. A sensation that you are being watched not by eyes of flesh and blood, but by eyes carved into walls, painted in ochre and blue, eyes meant to guard the passage to eternity. Local workers who labored in the valley carried their own unease. For them, the valley was not just history, it was sacred. It was dangerous. They would tell stories of spirits that walked the sands, of jackals that prowled not as animals but as messengers of Anubis, the god of the dead. They would warn each other never to speak too loudly within the valley, never to disrespect the ground beneath their feet. It was said that those who mocked the dead, or disturbed them without reverence, would bring upon themselves a fate darker than night. This is the silence into which Howard Carter and his team stepped as they began their long search. For years, Carter believed that one final tomb remained hidden in the valley. He felt it in his bones, in the patterns of excavation, in the faint traces left behind by workers of the ancient world. While others declared the Valley of the Kings exhausted, Carter insisted it still held a secret. And so he searched. Year after year, through dust, through disappointment, through the endless heat of the desert. His patron, Lord Carnarvon, grew weary of the expense and the lack of results. Others laughed at Carter's stubborn hope. Yet still, he searched. Still, he believed. And all the while, the valley remained silent. The tomb of Tutankhamun, hidden deep beneath the sand, waited. Its stones were sealed, its treasures preserved, its king resting in shadow. But if the legends were true, if curses were real, then the valley was not silent out of emptiness. It was silent out of warning. A warning that what slept beneath should not be disturbed. As the sun dips lower in the west and shadows stretch across the cliffs, the valley seems to change. The golden brightness fades to dusky tones. The air grows cooler, and the silence deepens, heavy and thick. Workers leave the valley for the night, carrying with them tools, baskets, and their own whispered stories. And when the last footsteps fade, the valley returns to its eternal stillness. The moon rises, casting pale light across the sands. The cliffs loom like guardians, the stars will above in their silent dance, and somewhere below, in the earth's cool embrace, the boy king dreams undisturbed. For now. Because soon, very soon, the stillness will be broken. The sealed door will be found. The curse will awaken. And the valley will. Archaeologists of the 19th century had catalogued, measured, and unearthed dozens more. By the time Howard Carter returned to the desert in the early 1900s, many experts declared that the sands had yielded all they had to give. To them, the valley was exhausted, its treasures stripped bare. But Carter was not convinced. Day after day, under the relentless Egyptian sun, he walked the valley's dusty paths with the eyes of a man who saw patterns others missed. He studied the way the tombs aligned, the markers of ancient workmen's huts, the faint traces in the soil where tools had once scraped stone. Something told him there was one tomb left, one overlooked, one waiting. It was not hope alone that drove him, but instinct sharpened by years of study and quiet obsession. And so, the work began. With the financial backing of his patron, Lord Carnarvon, Carter employed teams of local Egyptian workers who knew the valley's every curve, its hidden gullies and slopes. Under Carter's direction, they sifted, dug, and brushed away the ages. Dust rose in clouds. The sound of pickaxes striking stone echoed against the cliffs. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. Still, nothing. Lord Carnarvon grew weary. Money drained, patience thinned. The promise of discovery seemed like a mirage. Other archaeologists whispered that Carter's obsession had blinded him, that he was chasing shadows across the desert. More than once, Carnarvon considered calling an end to the search. But Carter pleaded for more time. Always, he felt the valley's silence was hiding something. It was November of 1922 when everything changed. The morning began as countless others had. The workers gathered, the tools were prepared, and the excavation of a site near the entrance to the tomb of Ramses VI continued. The spot seemed unremarkable, a patch of ground partially covered by huts once used by ancient laborers. Yet Carter's persistence led him here, convinced that beneath this debris, something lay concealed. The men dug. Sand shifted, stones scraped. Then something unusual appeared. A step. Just one, at first, cut into the bedrock. The workers paused. Carter leaned in, brushing away sand with careful hands. Another step revealed itself, then another. Soon, a staircase began to descend into shadow, each stone step carved thousands of years ago, each one hidden from the sun for centuries. Carter's heart quickened. This was no natural formation, no chance to cut stone. It was a passage. With painstaking care, they cleared away more rubble. The staircase descended deeper, the sand falling back to reveal the shape of an entrance at its end. At last, the top of a sealed doorway emerged. He sent word to Lord Carnarvon at once. The message traveled across the world, carried by telegram. At last I have made a wonderful discovery in the valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact, recovered until your arrival. Congratulations. The valley, long silent, now hummed with anticipation. When Carnarvon finally arrived in Egypt, he and Carter descended the newly unearthed staircase together. Their lanterns flickered in the gloom, casting trembling light against the plastered doorway. The ancient seal, marked with symbols of the necropolis, glowed faintly in the glow of the flame. With trembling hands, Carter directed a small breach to be made in the upper corner. He pressed his face close to the opening, holding a candle, and peered within. For a long moment, he said nothing. Silence hung heavy in the chamber, broken only by Carnarvon's impatient question, "Can you see anything?" Carter's voice trembled as he whispered the words that would echo through history. "Yes. Wonderful things." Through the tiny hole, his candlelight reflected off gold. Everywhere, gold. Statues, couches, chariots, thrones, ornaments, treasures piled upon treasures, all shimmering in the dusty air of a chamber sealed for over 3,000 years. The silence of the valley had broken. The tomb of Tutankhamun had been found. But what Carter and Carnarvon did not yet realize was that their discovery would ignite more than wonder. It would ignite fear. Because soon after, stories would spread of a curse, one said to punish any who dared disturb the boy king's eternal rest. For now, though, the men stood awestruck at the threshold of eternity, staring into the glittering chamber of a forgotten king. The Valley of the Kings, so long quiet, whispered once more. And with that whisper came the first stirrings of a legend that would haunt the modern world. The unsealing of the tomb. The air inside the Valley of the Kings grew still as the November night deepened. Lanterns glowed faintly against the cliff walls, casting long, quivering shadows across the excavation site where rubble had been cleared away and the ancient staircase now stood exposed. The entrance at its base, the plastered doorway with necropolis seals intact, seemed to breathe its own silence. For more than 3,000 years, it had held the darkness of eternity. Now, at the edge of that silence, modern hands prepared to intrude. Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon stood before the door as though it were a threshold between worlds. The faint desert wind brushed past them, lifting sand in gentle swirls, whispering through the valley's gullies. It was as if the land itself sighed, aware of what was about to happen. The first breach had already shown Carter treasures gold glinting in the flicker of a candle. But now came the greater act, to open the tomb fully, to step inside, to unseal what the ancient priests had so carefully hidden. The workers cleared the last of the blocking stones. With deliberate care, Carter raised a lantern and directed a small opening to be cut through the sealed plaster. Dust fell in a thin cascade, carrying with it the faint scent of age, of time itself. Then, with a groaning whisper, the breach widened. Carter held his lantern aloft, and its flame flickered against a chamber revealed for the first time since antiquity. Gasps broke the silence. Inside was a vision of wonder. The antechamber stretched before them, filled to bursting with treasures stacked in breathtaking disarray. Gilded couches shaped like fierce animals crouched beside painted chariots. Thrones with inlaid ivory gleamed beneath the dust of centuries. Chests, sealed with cord and clay, were piled high as if waiting for their master's return. Everywhere the light touched, it reflected off gold, silver, and polished stone. The effect was overwhelming, a sea of wonderful things that seemed almost dreamlike in their brilliance. Carter stepped forward, his boots pressing softly against dust that no foot had disturbed for thousands of years. The air was heavy, ancient, carrying the scent of resins and oils, still faintly lingering after millennia. His lantern trembled slightly in his grasp, not from the desert breeze, but from the weight of awe. He described it later as a moment that existed outside time, a suspension between life and death, history and eternity. And yet, in the silence of discovery, another whisper lingered, one of unease. For among the treasures, there was something uncanny. Many objects seemed arranged as if hurriedly placed, as if some ancient hand had rushed to secure them before the tomb was sealed. And on the plastered doorway beyond the antechamber, which led deeper still into the tomb, the necropolis seals remained unbroken. Beyond lay the burial chamber itself, untouched. The next day, work continued under feverish intensity. Photographs were taken, notes scribbled, every detail preserved before the treasures were moved. Carter insisted on meticulous care, each item catalogued, each chest examined. But the sheer abundance was staggering. Furniture, jewelry, ritual objects, weapons, statuettes, canopic jars, everything a king might need in the afterlife was here, waiting as though time had stood still. The world outside began to stir with news of the find. Newspapers spoke of the Tomb of Gold. Crowds gathered in Cairo, in London, in New York, eager for details. But alongside the thrill of discovery, darker murmurs began to rise. Old Egyptian workers spoke of ancient protections, of warnings carved into tomb walls. They whispered of a curse that would strike down any who disturbed the eternal sleep of the pharaohs. At first, Carter dismissed it as superstition. He was a man of the tomb. The Valley of the Kings, once silent, now hummed with something more than excitement. There was a weight in the air, as though the gaze of history or perhaps something older rested upon them. When at last the day came to open the second sealed doorway, the anticipation was nearly unbearable. Carter and Carnarvon gathered with a few trusted companions. Their lanterns flickered against the white plaster. With careful hands, Carter made the breach. Stone cracked softly, dust rose, and the lantern's glow poured into the chamber beyond. This time, the sight was even greater. The burial chamber revealed itself in dim grandeur. At its center stood an immense shrine, gilded and glowing, filling the chamber from wall to wall. Carved with hieroglyphs and sacred figures, it seemed less like an object and more like a temple in miniature. Four nested shrines enclosed one another, each designed to protect what lay at the heart of the tomb, the sarcophagus of the boy king himself. Around the chamber, further treasures stood arranged, statues of guardian deities, their eyes inlaid with stone that seemed to glimmer with watchful life, alabaster lamps, their surfaces carved with scenes of gods and offerings, sacred symbols placed with care to shield the king on his eternal journey. The atmosphere grew heavier, as though the air itself resisted intrusion. Carter's men whispered prayers in Arabic under their breath, crossing themselves, glancing nervously at the sealed shrines. The curse, they said, was not just a story, it lived here, in the stillness, in the eyes of the guardians that seemed to follow every movement. Yet Carter pressed on. With patience and reverence, he directed the dismantling of the gilded shrines, layer by layer. Each one revealed another, until finally the great stone sarcophagus emerged, carved from quartzite, heavy and eternal. Its lid bore the likeness of the king, serene in death. Inside, further coffins awaited, each more ornate than the last. The final coffin, gleaming with solid gold, held the mummified body of Tutankhamun himself, his face covered by the most iconic artifact of all time, the golden mask. It was an image that would travel the globe, a face of eternal youth and mystery, its eyes gazing out across millennia. The boy king who died at 18, forgotten by history, had returned to captivate the world. But as the treasures came to light, so too did the whispers grow louder. Soon after the unsealing of the tomb, strange events began to unfold. Lord Carnarvon, who had funded the search, suffered a sudden illness and died not long after, his death accompanied by eerie coincidences, a blackout in Cairo at the moment of his passing, and the cry of his dog far away in England said to have marked the same instant. Newspapers seized upon it. The curse of the pharaoh, they declared, had struck. Whether truth or legend, the stories took hold. Each death, each misfortune among those connected with the tomb, was woven into the tapestry of the curse. And while Carter himself lived long after, the shadow of the legend clung to him. Still, in that moment of discovery, as the burial chamber unfolded before their eyes, none could have predicted the force this story would take upon the modern imagination. The treasures of Tutankhamun dazzled the senses, but the whispers of doom gave them life beyond gold. The tomb was not just a chamber of artifacts, it was a stage upon which history, mystery, and myth would perform together, echoing forever. And as the lanterns dimmed and the ancient air pressed close, the watchers of the valley knew, the tomb was no longer silent. The world would never forget what had been found or the shadow it carried with it. The shadow of the curse. The valley was no longer silent. The sands of Thebes had held their secrets for millennia, but once Tutankhamun's tomb was opened, the world outside seemed to awaken with rumor, fascination, and unease. What began as whispers among the workers soon rippled outward into headlines, until the whole globe leaned closer, eager not only for tales of treasure but for something darker, the curse of the Pharaoh. It began with a single death. Lord Carnarvon, the man who had financed Howard Carter's long and often frustrating search, was one of the first to enter the tomb. Only months later, he fell ill with a sudden fever after a mosquito bite became infected. His decline was rapid and agonizing, and on a warm April night in Cairo, he breathed his last. At that very moment, the city's electric lights flickered and went out, plunging the capital into darkness. Thousands of miles away in England, his dog was said to have lifted its head, let out a piercing howl, and collapsed dead. The story was too potent to ignore. Within days, newspapers across Europe and America carried the tale of the curse. "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king," they proclaimed, attributing the warning to inscriptions found on tomb walls. Though Carter himself denied any such curse was inscribed within Tutankhamun's resting place, the idea took on a life of its own. Soon, every death, every illness, every misfortune connected with the excavation was gathered into a growing legend. Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey, an Egyptian prince who had visited the tomb, was murdered in London. George J. Gould, a wealthy American financier, toured the site and died shortly after of a fever. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, the radiologist who first examined the mummy of Tutankhamun, succumbed to a mysterious illness. Even Carter's secretary, Richard Bethel, died under strange circumstances, found lifeless in his bed at a London club. His father, overcome with grief, reportedly threw himself from a building. Each event was seized upon by a hungry press. The idea of a curse spread like fire through the imagination of the world. At a time when fascination with the exotic East, with the mysteries of Egypt and the supernatural, was already high, the curse became a symbol of the unknown, the dark price of human curiosity and intrusion into the sacred. For Carter, the rumors were frustrating. He had dedicated years of his life to careful excavation, to documenting treasures with scientific precision. He saw himself as a preserver of history, not a violator of sacred rest. Yet even he could not fully escape the weight of the stories. Workers crossed themselves before entering the site, muttering prayers. Visitors carried amulets for protection. Each creak of the valley's shifting rock, each gust of hot wind, seemed to feed the tale. And there was more than simple superstition at play. The tomb itself seemed steeped in a silence that unsettled even the most rational of minds. Statues of jackal-headed gods stared with cold eyes from the shadows. Sacred symbols of protection, scarabs, cobras, falcons surrounded the sarcophagus. Ancient Egyptians had believed fervently in the power of curses, binding their spells into the very objects of the tomb. Could it be, people wondered, that something of that old magic lingered still, waiting to strike? Meanwhile, the treasures of Tutankhamun began their journey beyond the desert. Objects from the tomb were catalogued, restored, and eventually displayed to the public. Wherever they traveled, enormous crowds gathered. Yet the curse followed too. When exhibitions were held, accidents occurred, ships carrying artifacts were delayed by storms, workers transporting objects fell sick, curators spoke in hushed tones of an atmosphere that seemed to cling to the relics. The world's fascination grew. Authors wove tales of pharaohs and curses. Playwrights and filmmakers built stories of ancient revenge and eternal punishment. In drawing rooms and parlors, in lecture halls and cafes, people whispered, "Did Tutankhamun reach out from beyond the grave to punish those who had disturbed him?" Carter himself remained untouched. He lived for more than a decade after the tomb's discovery, working tirelessly to complete the excavation and its documentation. His survival was often cited as proof against the curse. Yet to others, it was said that he had been spared not as a mercy, but as a punishment of its own kind. To live long, to watch others fall away, to bear the burden of a discovery both magnificent and feared that was its own curse. As the years passed, the line between truth and myth blurred. Many of the supposed victims of the curse had been elderly, or in poor health, or simply unlucky. Yet in the collective imagination, the details hardly mattered. What endured was the pattern, the chilling suggestion. Even scientists could not entirely banish the mystery. Some speculated that toxic molds, sealed in the tomb for centuries, could have poisoned the air and caused illness to those who entered. Others pointed to coincidences, amplified by fear and expectation. But for every explanation, there remained the allure of the unknown, the sense that in disturbing the king's eternal rest, the modern world had awakened forces it could not understand. The shadow of the curse lingered not just in Egypt, but across oceans, across decades. It appeared in newspapers, in novels, in hushed conversations. It seeped into the culture of the 20th century, a story that was part history, part myth, and part cautionary tale. And perhaps that is why it endured. For the curse was never only about Tutankhamun. It was about the boundaries between the living and the dead, about humanity's longing to touch the past, and its fear of what such contact might unleash. It was about the fragility of life, set against the permanence of stone, gold, and gods. In the Valley of the Kings, the sun still set behind the cliffs, painting the sands in crimson light. The tombs still lay in silence, their walls carved with prayers to protect the departed. And somewhere beneath the shifting earth, the treasures of Tutankhamun gleamed softly in the darkness, as if reminding the world, some mysteries are never fully ours to claim. The curse, whether real or imagined, had done its work. It had transformed a discovery into a legend. It had wrapped history in a shroud of awe and fear. And as the decades passed, its shadow would only grow longer. Between myth and history, the story of Tutankhamun's tomb had spread like wildfire. From Cairo to London, from New York to Tokyo, the name of the boy king filled newspapers and conversation. But beneath the glitter of treasure and the shadows of a supposed curse lay a subtler truth. That what had unfolded in the Valley of the Kings was not simply an excavation, nor a haunting, but something that belonged to both realms, the realm of history, and the realm of myth. The newspapers had fanned the flames of the curse. They wrote of sudden deaths and eerie coincidences in bold headlines, while burying quieter details in the fine print. Each tragedy was linked, whether by proximity or imagination, to the tomb. The death of Lord Carnarvon was indeed real, and strange in its timing. But when examined closely, the string of curse victims seemed less mysterious. Some were elderly. Some carried illnesses long before the tomb was opened. Some, like George Gould, had been weakened by years of strain and travel. Others had no direct contact with the tomb at all, but were simply associated with its story. Yet even if reason could explain the events, imagination was harder to tame. For centuries, Egyptian tombs had carried warnings. On the walls of pyramids and mastabas, carved in hieroglyphs, priests inscribed phrases like, "Death shall come to he who disturbs this place," or, "The vulture and the serpent shall strike him who crosses this threshold." Such words were not meant for the modern world, but for the Egyptians themselves, for thieves, rivals, or enemies who might seek to break into sacred places. They were spiritual locks, prayers woven into stone. When these echoes of ancient belief were combined with the dramatic death of Carnarvon, the world leapt to connect them. The result was not history, but something older, the human tendency to shape stories from uncertainty. The curse became less about Tutankhamun, and more about the collective longing for mystery in an age that prided itself on science and progress. For the early 20th century was a paradox. Airplanes now soared in the skies. Telephones carried voices across continents. Medicine was advancing with astonishing speed. Yet with all this knowledge came a kind of disillusionment, a sense that wonder itself was slipping away. Ancient Egypt, with its timeless monuments, its cryptic gods, and its promise of hidden secrets, offered something that no modern invention could, a gateway into the eternal. And so the curse was embraced, not rejected. For many, it was proof that the ancients had known powers beyond our own. For others, it was simply a thrill, a story that gave ordinary life the brush of something uncanny. For the archaeologists, it was both a hindrance and a tool. While Carter bristled at the superstition, others found that the rumors fueled public fascination, drawing attention, funding, and fame. Between myth and history lay the delicate figure of Tutankhamun himself. A boy king, crowned in childhood, dead by the age of 19, buried in a tomb smaller than his station would have suggested. His death was abrupt, his legacy almost erased. Yet in death he had become eternal. His tomb, untouched by looters, had preserved him not as a ruler of Egypt, but as a ruler of memory, presiding over one of the greatest discoveries of all time. The treasures of the tomb became objects of study, catalogued with precision, photographed, and stored. But to the world beyond Egypt, they were more than relics, they were talismans of wonder. The golden mask, its lapis inlay gleaming, became an icon of Egypt itself. The statues, the chariots, the amulets, each seemed alive with stories. They were fragments of a life that had ended 3,000 years before, and yet they breathed in the present. As myth and history entwined, the tomb of Tutankhamun became a kind of mirror. To scholars, it reflected the artistry and devotion of ancient craftsmen. To dreamers, it reflected the allure of mystery and the unknown. To the superstitious, it reflected fear of trespassing into realms best left undisturbed. And so the story endured, not because of curses alone, nor because of treasures alone, but because it satisfied something deeper within the human spirit, the desire to believe that the past is never truly gone, that the dead may still speak, that wonder still lies buried beneath the sands, waiting to be found. Carter's meticulous notes, the artifacts themselves, and the scientific reports formed one layer of truth. The headlines, the novels, the whispered tales of shadows in the tomb, formed another. Between them lay the world's imagination, a space where myth and history could never be fully untangled. And perhaps that is why Tutankhamun's story remains so alive today. Not simply because of what was uncovered, but because of what was dreamed. Not because of what the ancient Egyptians left behind, but because of what the modern world needed to see in them. The Valley of the Kings had given up a secret, but in doing so, it had woven a new mystery that belonged not to the sands, but to us all. The science of the mummy. Long after the flickering lanterns of Carter's team had dimmed, and long after the breathless headlines of curses and mystery had faded into archives, another chapter in Tutankhamun's story began to unfold. This was a quieter chapter, one written not in the language of myth, but in the measured tones of science. And yet, even here, in the heart of laboratories and beneath the glow of X-ray machines, the aura of mystery still clung to the boy king like desert sand that will not be shaken away. The mummy of Tutankhamun, resting in its coffin within the Valley of the Kings, had always been more than a body. To Carter and his contemporaries, it was a relic wrapped in layers of resin, an object to be studied with care, catalogued, and preserved. To the modern world, however, it became something else. A silent witness, capable of telling the story of a life cut short, of a body both regal and fragile, of death that had left questions unanswered for over 3,000 years. The first examinations were cautious. In 1925, Carter's team attempted to lift the mummy from its coffin, but found the body so deeply fused with hardened resin that it clung stubbornly to its golden bed. In their effort, they caused damage, breaking bones and dislodging limbs. It was an unfortunate consequence of methods available at the time, and though done with intent to study, it left scars that would complicate understanding for decades to come. Still, the desire to know persisted. What had killed Tutankhamun? A boy, barely 19, in the prime of youth. Why had his reign ended so abruptly? Was it illness, injury, or something darker, a murder, perhaps, concealed within history's folds? Decades passed. New technologies emerged. In 1968, scientists from Liverpool brought X-ray machines into the Valley of the Kings. For the first, invisible light pierced the wrappings, revealing what lay within without tearing away the linen. The images were hazy by modern standards, but they suggested something startling: fragments of bone at the base of the skull. Whispers rose immediately. Was this evidence of a blow to the head? A royal assassination, carried out in secret? The curse, it seemed, had a scientific echo. For years, the theory of murder lingered, a dark possibility that matched the drama of Tutankhamun's legend. Yet science, patient and persistent, continued its work. In 2005, a team of Egyptian scientists, aided by international experts, brought a CT scanner into the valley. Slowly, the machine hummed to life, sliding Tutankhamun's remains into its ring, capturing three-dimensional images in extraordinary detail. Layer by layer, the ancient body was revealed not as a legend, but as flesh, bone, and history preserved in silence. The scans told a different story. The skull fracture, once thought to be a mortal wound, appeared instead to have occurred after death, perhaps the result of Carter's early attempts to free the resin-fused body, or the natural process of handling over centuries. Murder by a blow to the head was unlikely. The story shifted again. But the scans revealed something else: a fracture in the left thigh bone, a severe injury that may have been sustained shortly before death. Some believed it suggested a chariot accident, a fall, or even a deliberate strike. Combined with evidence of infection, the possibility arose that sepsis had set in, claiming the young king's life. Others suggested genetic weakness. DNA analysis, conducted in 2010, revealed traces of malaria in the body, one of the earliest confirmations of the disease in ancient remains. Perhaps Tutankhamun had been ill, weakened by malaria, and the injury sealed his fate. More discoveries followed. Scans of the chest cavity revealed the absence of sternum and ribs, leading some to theorize fire damage caused either by a chemical reaction in the resins used during mummification or by mishandling long after burial. Others believed it was deliberate removal, part of a funerary ritual unusual for its time. Each theory added another strand to the web, never fully resolving, always shifting between certainty and possibility. And beneath it all lay another truth: Tutankhamun himself was frail. DNA evidence pointed to inbreeding, the result of generations of royal marriages among close kin. The boy king's body showed signs of clubfoot, a cleft palate, and other congenital difficulties. He may have walked with a cane. Indeed, Carter's team had found dozens of walking sticks among the treasures, once overlooked as symbols of authority, now reinterpreted as tools of necessity. Tutankhamun, the golden ruler of Egypt, may have struggled simply to walk across his palace floor. This image of the king, fragile, young, burdened by ailment, stood in stark contrast to the shining mask that bore his face in perfection. It was as if the ancient Egyptians had sought to restore in death what life had denied him. In gold and lapis, they had remade him whole, strong, eternal. The mummy told the story of weakness, the mask told the story of immortality. Between them lay the paradox of Tutankhamun. As modern science advanced, the mummy continued to yield its secrets, though never all of them. Each discovery closed one door while opening another. Illness, injury, accident, ritual, all were possibilities, woven together in a tapestry that no single answer could unravel. And perhaps, in that ambiguity, Tutankhamun retained something of his mystery. Even under the scrutiny of X-rays and CT scans, even under the precise analysis of DNA, he remained elusive, never fully captured. The curse of Tutankhamun's tomb, once spoken in whispers of death and shadow, had given way to a new kind of wonder, the awe of science peering into the ancient past, uncovering not terror, but humanity. The boy king was no longer just a figure of myth, but a human being, fragile and mortal, whose body still carried the weight of history across 30 centuries. And so the story shifted once more. From discovery to curse, from superstition to science, Tutankhamun's tomb remained a wellspring of fascination. Each era found in it a reflection of its own desires: mystery for the dreamers, treasure for the seekers, knowledge for the scientists. The sands of Egypt had preserved him not only in resin and linen, but in endless layers of meaning, each waiting to be uncovered by those who came after. The body of the king lay still, but the story of the king was always moving, always alive. The afterlife of treasures. The tomb of Tutankhamun had been sealed for more than 3,000 years, hidden beneath the desert sands of the Valley of the Kings, when Howard Carter first brushed away the dust from its sealed doorway. Within its chambers, the boy king lay surrounded by objects of unimaginable beauty: golden shrines, chariots, jewelry, weapons, statues, furniture, alabaster jars, delicate sandals woven from reeds, and, at the very heart of it all, the golden mask that would one day gaze into the eyes of the modern world. When Carter and Lord Carnarvon broke the seals, they did not simply uncover a resting place. They opened a door to a new era of fascination. For in those treasures so carefully crafted, so lovingly placed beside the young pharaoh, Egypt itself seemed to awaken. The boy king, who had ruled only briefly and died young, suddenly became one of the most famous figures in all of history. His afterlife had begun, not in the halls of Osiris alone, but in the imaginations of billions across the earth. The artifacts, once entombed in silence, began their long journey outward. Carter and his team worked patiently, cataloging more than 5,000 objects from the tomb, each one a story in miniature. The golden throne, its backrest glowing with images of the young king and his queen. The tiny dagger, its blade forged from meteoric iron, perhaps fallen from the heavens themselves. The chests filled with jewels, each stone polished with patience, each design humming with symbolism. These objects were not only treasures, they were messages, carrying across time the rituals, beliefs, and artistry of a civilization. And in their presence, the world felt an almost spiritual awe. But Tutankhamun's treasures could not remain confined to the valley. Slowly, carefully, they began to travel. In the mid-20th century, the golden mask, the chariots, the statues, and countless smaller objects were prepared for exhibitions. The world, still reeling from wars and change, suddenly found itself face to face with the past in a way it never had before. When the treasures left Egypt for the first great international tours, it was as if the boy king himself had stepped into the modern age. In 1961, a selection of artifacts was displayed in Paris, drawing thousands. In 1972, the British Museum opened its doors to a landmark exhibition. There, beneath the gaze of millions of visitors, Tutankhamun's golden mask gleamed as though lit from within. Queues stretched for hours, wrapping around the streets of London. Newspapers declared it the exhibition of the century. For many, it was their first encounter with ancient Egypt, not through books or imagination, but through the physical presence of the objects themselves. Then came America. In 1976, a grand tour was launched, visiting Washington, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and beyond. More than 8 million people filed past the cases, whispering in reverent tones, pressing their faces close to the glass to glimpse the work of hands that had shaped gold and lapis 3 millennia earlier. In the midst of modern cities of steel and glass, Tutankhamun's treasures radiated a light of eternity. Wherever they traveled, the treasures brought with them an atmosphere that was almost sacred. Visitors often described feeling as though they stood in the tomb itself, transported across oceans and centuries. Children clutched souvenir books, eyes wide with wonder. Scholars scribbled notes. Artists found inspiration in the flowing lines of Egyptian design. And everywhere, the image of the golden mask, calm, eternal, regal, seemed to settle into the collective memory of humankind. This was Tutankhamun's second life. In death, he had been buried with objects meant to guide him through the afterlife. In rediscovery, those same objects guided the modern world into a renewed fascination with Egypt. The treasures became ambassadors, carrying with them the magic of a civilization long vanished, and yet, their journeys were not without controversy. For many Egyptians, the departure of the treasures to foreign museums raised questions of ownership and legacy. Should the boy king's belongings ever have left the Nile Valley at all? Were they not part of Egypt's very soul, meant to remain in the land of his birth? Over time, a stronger desire grew within Egypt to preserve its treasures at home, to ensure that Tutankhamun's afterlife belonged first and foremost to his people. Today, the artifacts of Tutankhamun rest primarily in Cairo, many soon to be displayed in the vast Grand Egyptian Museum near the Pyramids of Giza. There, under careful light and watchful eyes, they will tell their story not only to Egyptians, but to visitors from every corner of the world. The golden mask, shimmering with lapis lazuli and quartz, will once again become the centerpiece of a face that has become a global icon. But even as the treasures rest in glass cases, their journey is far from over. For every visitor who gazes upon them, every child who learns the name Tutankhamun in school, every book, film, or documentary inspired by their beauty, the treasures live anew. They are not silent. They whisper of craftsmen's hands in ancient workshops, of rituals under torchlight, of a young king prepared for eternity. The afterlife of Tutankhamun's treasures is not measured only in their physical survival, but in the endless ripples they cast across imagination. They inspire curiosity, dreams, and even art. They remind us that the past is not buried, but alive, glowing with golden light across time. From desert tomb to crowded museum hall, from silence to awe, from death to eternal life, Tutankhamun's treasures continue their journey. And with each new gaze, each reverent whisper, they fulfill the purpose for which they were made, to ensure that the boy king would never be forgotten. Tutankhamun in popular culture. The treasures of Tutankhamun did not remain only in the stillness of museum galleries or the quiet corridors of academia. Once the golden mask had been lifted into the light, once the images had graced newspapers and television screens, the young king leapt into a new kind of immortality, one not bound by tomb walls or sacred rituals, but woven into the fabric of popular culture itself. It began with fascination, of course, as writers, poets, and artists sought to capture the magic of the rediscovery. The 1920s were a decade, and soon, the boy king was no longer simply an archaeological discovery. He was a symbol and an icon who belonged not just to history, but to imagination. Art Deco, the design movement of the age, was deeply touched by this wave of Egyptomania. The geometric patterns of Egyptian art, the lotus columns, the flowing lines of hieroglyphs, all of these began to appear in jewelry, furniture, and even architecture. Across Paris, London, and New York, the influence of Tutankhamun shimmered in the decorative arts. Earrings shaped like scarabs, gowns embroidered with Egyptian motifs, lamps and vases echoing the golden hues of the treasures, all whispered of a world that seemed both ancient and utterly modern. Cinema, still in its youth, quickly embraced the allure. By the 1930s, Hollywood had discovered Egypt as a stage for fantasy and adventure. Films such as The Mummy wove tales of curses and romance, directly inspired by the global fascination with Tutankhamun's tomb. The imagery was unmistakable: bandaged figures rising from sarcophagi, shadowed temples lit by torchlight, treasures gleaming in the sand. While these films often blurred history with imagination, they ensured that the pharaoh's aura remained alive in the collective dream. And it was not only in the golden age of cinema that Tutankhamun appeared. Decades later, his face, the serene golden mask with its striped names, headdress and calm eyes, became one of the most reproduced images in the world. It appeared on book covers, posters, and museum pamphlets. It was painted onto canvases by modern artists, printed onto t-shirts, even mimicked in fashion shows. The boy king had become, quite unexpectedly, a global brand. In literature, too, his name echoed. Novelists spun stories around the discovery of the tomb, weaving romance, danger, and mystery into tales that kept the curse alive. Children's books introduced young readers to the adventure of archaeology through the story of Carter and the Valley of the Kings. In poetry, the treasures were invoked as metaphors for memory, time, and the strange endurance of beauty. Each new work, whether serious or playful, added another thread to the tapestry of Tutankhamun's modern presence. Even in music, the echoes were heard. Jazz songs of the 1920s referenced King Tut with playful rhythms. Later, in the 1970s, comedian Steve Martin performed his famous satirical song, King Tut, on American television, reminding audiences of just how deeply the boy king had entered popular awareness. Though light-hearted, even humorous, it demonstrated a truth: Tutankhamun was not only a subject of scholarship, he was part of culture itself, alive in the minds of millions. Fashion houses continued to draw upon the imagery of the mask and the jewelry. Gold cuffs, wide collars, and flowing gowns evoked the queenly figures found in the tomb. The deep blues of lapis lazuli and the bright reds of carnelian stones appeared in collections across Paris and Milan. To wear such colors, to echo such designs, was to step, however briefly, into the aura of the Nile. And beyond art, film, and fashion, Tutankhamun even found his way into language. Phrases like, "the curse of the pharaohs," became shorthand for mysterious misfortune. To call someone a modern-day King Tut was to suggest opulence, youth, and an almost mythic allure. The boy king was no longer only an archaeological figure. He was part of everyday imagination. But perhaps what is most extraordinary is the way Tutankhamun became a symbol of wonder itself. His story was not only about riches or curses, but about discovering the act of uncovering something hidden, something lost, something that whispers from beyond time. In this sense, he became a metaphor for human curiosity, for the eternal quest to seek and to know. Even today, when new exhibitions open, when the golden mask is displayed, when books or films return to his story, the fascination is renewed. Crowds still queue, as they did in London in 1972 and in America in 1976. Millions still gaze into the calm eyes of the golden mask, feeling as though they are seen in return. The magic has not faded. If anything, it has deepened, for the world has changed around Tutankhamun, yet he remains eternal, uneged, a figure who unites the ancient with the modern. And so, the boy king lives not only in his treasures or in the sands of his tomb. He lives in Art Deco designs and Hollywood films, in jazz songs and children's novels, in fashion runways and everyday speech. He lives wherever imagination seeks him, wherever wonder awakens. Tutankhamun, the child who once ruled Egypt, became in death not only a pharaoh but a symbol of humanity's endless fascination with the past. He is the golden face of mystery itself, an image that will endure, as long as there are dreamers to remember. The eternal pharaoh. There are figures in history who pass quietly into the past, their names fading like dust blown across forgotten stones. And then there are those who, for reasons half understood and half mysterious, live on not merely as names in books, but as archetypes, symbols, timeless presences. Tutankhamun belongs to the latter. His reign may have been short, his deeds relatively modest compared to the great builders and conquerors of Egypt, yet his memory has stretched far beyond them. He has become not just a pharaoh of the past, but an eternal pharaoh of the imagination. What makes this transformation so remarkable is that it was not inevitable. For centuries after his burial, Tutankhamun's name was nearly erased. The stones of his monuments carried little record, the memory of his dynasty obscured by the long sweep of Egyptian history. He was a boy king, overshadowed by predecessors and successors of greater power. By all logic, his life should have passed into silence, known only to the sands. And yet, something endured. It was not his rule alone, but his rediscovery. In that act of uncovering, in the moment when Carter's candle lit the golden glimmer of treasures untouched for 3,000 years, Tutankhamun's destiny shifted. From a forgotten ruler, he became a living myth. The treasures, the mask, the murmurs of a curse, all of these combined to shape him into something larger than history. And so, Tutankhamun came to embody not just Egypt, but the eternal human longing for youth, for beauty, for mystery that does not fade. His golden mask became a face not merely of a king, but of an ideal, the calm serenity of eternal youth preserved against the ravages of time. The serene, almond-shaped eyes look not only back through the centuries, but forward into all who gaze upon them, as though saying, "I was young, and I remain so forever." In this way, Tutankhamun became an archetype, the eternal child ruler, a symbol of promise never fully realized, of life interrupted yet somehow unending. Unlike Ramses, whose monuments proclaim power, or Akhenaten, whose revolution tells of upheaval, Tutankhamun's story whispers of fragility and endurance together. He is youth itself, sealed in gold, never aging, never fading. The world has embraced this image. To millions, he is less a pharaoh of a particular dynasty and more a universal figure, an emblem of mystery, of discovery, of beauty preserved beyond death. His mask is more than an artifact, it is an icon. One might place it beside the Mona Lisa, or Michelangelo's David, or the statues of Buddha, images that transcend their origins to speak across cultures. And in becoming an archetype, Tutankhamun also became a paradox. In life, he may have been frail, perhaps sickly, a boy burdened with power he could scarcely wield. Yet in memory, he is radiant, flawless, eternal. Death has not diminished him but perfected him. His survival is not of flesh, but of symbol. For some, he represents mystery itself, the hidden, the buried, the waiting truth that can only be uncovered with patience and reverence. For others, he embodies youth untouched by decay, a vision of immortality in golden form. And for still others, he is a reminder of destiny, of how chance and circumstance can carry a forgotten boy into the center of the world's imagination. Even now, scholars continue to study his remains, to test theories of his life and death. Was he struck down by illness? By injury? Did palace intrigues shorten his reign? Each hypothesis, however carefully examined, becomes part of the wider myth, feeding the fascination rather than ending it. For no matter what science uncovers, the aura of Tutankhamun persists. He is not reducible to bone measurements or genetic data. He lives in a realm beyond proof, where history becomes legend, and perhaps this is why his story endures so powerfully. Tutankhamun has become less about the facts of his reign and more about the enduring mystery of existence itself, the longing for beauty, the curiosity for the hidden, the fascination with the passage of time. His tomb was sealed, yet it was opened. His name was erased, yet it was remembered. His life was short, yet his memory is eternal. In this sense, he is not only a pharaoh of Egypt. He is a pharaoh of the imagination, a ruler of dreams and questions, an eternal figure who transcends history's boundaries. Like the stars that gleamed over the Nile in ancient times, his light reaches us still, undimmed, whispering of wonder and the eternity hidden in youth. And so, when we look into the golden mask, we do not merely see an artifact of a long-lost dynasty. We see an eternal archetype, a presence that will outlast empires and nations, fashions and centuries. We see Tutankhamun, the eternal pharaoh whose legacy is not bound to stone or sand, but to the unending human desire to dream. The Valley of Kings, a timeless necropolis. Beneath the burning Egyptian sun, where the Nile winds in a ribbon of life through a desert of silence, lies a place set apart from time. This is the Valley of Kings, the resting place of pharaohs, priests, and princes, a sacred necropolis carved into the golden cliffs of Thebes. The very name stirs echoes of mystery, a valley where rock and sand conceal the dreams of eternity, where generations of rulers sought to outwit death by sealing themselves away within the embrace of stone. Tonight, in the stillness of our story, we step slowly into that valley. We wander not in haste, but in tranquility, letting the quiet hush of the desert cradle us in timeless calm. The Valley of Kings does not announce itself loudly. It is not lined with towering obelisks or colonnades of shining marble. Instead, it hides its majesty beneath austerity. The cliffs rise in ochre walls, jagged yet serene, the sunlight painting them in shifting shades of amber, rose, and gold. The ground is hard and dusty, the air dry, carrying the faint scent of stone warmed by centuries of relentless heat. Yet in this simplicity lies power. The valley is a womb of silence, and within its depths, the most powerful men of Egypt entrusted their passage into forever. As you stand at its entrance, imagine the solitude of the place. There are no bustling crowds, no markets, no laughter of children. The Valley of Kings was always a place apart, its purpose hidden even from the common people of Egypt. Only the chosen, the priests, the artisans of Deir el-Medina, the guardians sworn to secrecy, knew its purpose. To others, the valley was a place of awe, tinged with reverence and fear. For this was where gods in human form, the pharaohs, descended into eternity. The cliffs themselves seem almost alive, shaped into the form of a pyramid by the natural rise of the mountain Al-Qurn. It is as though the valley, though stripped of towering monuments, wore its own eternal crown. Pharaohs saw in this landscape not emptiness but eternity, a place where their tombs could be hidden from enemies and grave robbers, sealed away from the eyes of men. Close your eyes, and let us walk deeper into the valley. With each step, the air seems heavier, not oppressive, but filled with unseen weight, the weight of centuries, of secrets, of rituals whispered in the half-light of torches. The sun may blaze overhead, but down here in the gullies and hollows, a profound hush settles, as if even time itself holds its breath. In ancient days, this valley would have been a hive of hidden labor. Artisans from the nearby village of Deir el-Medina, men and women who devoted their lives to the service of eternity, would descend into the cliffs by torchlight. They carved passages into the living rock, smoothing walls, chiseling hieroglyphs, and painting vast murals of gods, demons, and journeys into the afterlife. Imagine the rhythm of hammer and chisel echoing in the stone chambers, the flicker of oil lamps casting moving shadows across faces etched with devotion. These workers were not merely laborers, they were participants in a sacred drama, each stroke of pigment or carving of glyph helping a king secure his immortality. Now, centuries later, we walk among their silent handiwork. Tomb entrances yawn from the cliffs, simple stone doorways leading into labyrinths of passage and chamber. Some are small and humble, others sprawling and ornate, filled with vaulted ceilings where stars still shine in painted midnight skies. Each tomb tells a story not only of the pharaoh it shelters but of the beliefs that sustained an entire civilization. Pause with me before one such tomb, its entrance low and cut directly into the rock. It may not look like much from the outside, just a hollowed arch with faded inscriptions, but step gently inside, and the world changes. The air cools immediately, a breath of stone that has not moved for centuries. The light dims, and the hush deepens. Downward the passage runs, sloping into the earth, painted walls glowing faintly even in the dimness. On one side, Osiris stands, green-skinned and crowned, lord of the underworld. On the other hand, Anubis, the jackal-headed guide of souls, waits with patience forever. Every wall is alive with images, pharaohs presenting offerings to gods, gods extending hands of blessing, serpents coiled in eternal battle, stars glittering against painted skies. It is not frightening, it is serene. For the Egyptians, death was not an ending but a passage, and these painted corridors were maps of eternity. The pharaoh would walk them in spirit, guided by spells inscribed from the Book of the Dead, shielded by amulets, and comforted by offerings of food and wine placed lovingly beside him. The tomb was a palace for forever, carved not to decay but to endure. As we linger in the chamber, let us imagine the day of burial. A procession winding from the Nile, priests chanting hymns, incense curling into the hot air, mourners wailing their grief while drums beat slow and steady. At the center of it all, the gilded coffin of the pharaoh, carried into the valley under veils of linen and gold. Down the passage the bearers descend, step by step, until they reach the burial chamber. There, the sarcophagus is lowered, the prayers intoned, the doors sealed. Behind the closing walls, treasures glitter in the torchlight, golden masks, alabaster jars, weapons of bronze, furniture inlaid with ivory. Each piece is not mere wealth, but a tool for the journey into eternity. Then the entrance is hidden, plastered over, concealed with rubble, so that no mortal eyes may find it again. The valley swallows its secret, and silence reigns once more. We know, of course, that silence was never eternal. Tomb robbers came, chisels and torches in hand, breaking through seals, looting treasures, scattering bones. Dynasties rose and fell, leaving behind new kings, new burials, new secrets hidden in stone. Yet the valley endures, a place where each pharaoh still sought sanctuary, hoping his tomb would be the one to remain untouched. For some, like Tutankhamun, fate would grant this wish. For others, their riches vanished, their names lost. Still, the valley itself remained, an eternal necropolis. As we stand here in imagination, picture the valley not as ruins, not as tourist paths lined with ropes, but as it once was: lonely, silent, guarded by cliffs and stars. At night, the desert sky would have stretched above, a canopy of endless brilliance. The Milky Way, to the Egyptians, was the celestial Nile, flowing across eternity. And beneath it, the tombs lay still, their occupants dreaming the dream of forever. There is a peace here that cannot be stolen. Even in death, even in loss, the Valley of Kings holds something eternal. Not simply the bones of rulers, but the memory of a civilization's belief in life beyond life, in order beyond chaos, in silence as the gateway to eternity. Now, as our story rests in this valley, breathe deeply. Imagine the warmth of the stone walls, the coolness of the hidden chambers, the weight of centuries pressing not as burden but as comfort. You are walking not among ruins, but among dreams carved in stone, dreams that whisper even now beneath the desert stars. The Valley of Kings is more than a place of death, it is the age of the pharaohs reborn. The Valley of Kings had long since fallen into silence, its tombs buried beneath the shifting sands, its painted walls fading in the dark. Yet, though centuries passed and empires rose and fell, Egypt never vanished from memory. Even in slumber, the pharaohs lingered, waiting for the world to rediscover them. And in time, that rediscovery came an awakening that would not only uncover hidden tombs but also breathe life once more into the age of the pharaohs. The rebirth began with whispers. Travelers from Greece and Rome had marveled at the ruins of temples and statues, writing of colossal forms that dwarfed mortal men. Later, in the Middle Ages, faint rumors spread of treasures hidden beneath the desert. But it was not until the great wave of exploration in the 18th and 19th centuries that Egypt's slumber truly began to stir. Imagine standing along the Nile in those years, when caravans of scholars, soldiers, and adventurers arrived in Cairo. They came not with torches and prayers but with measuring tapes, notebooks, and the restless hunger of curiosity. Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798 brought with it not only armies but scholars, artists, and draftsmen. They sketched the towering obelisks, copied inscriptions, and collected fragments of statues, recording everything they could see. Their findings, published in vast illustrated volumes, captivated Europe, spreading images of pyramids, hieroglyphs, and sphinxes into salons and universities. Egypt was no longer a silent ruin in the desert. It had become a dream reborn. This was the beginning of what historians now call Egyptomania. Suddenly, the ancient land of the Nile was everywhere. In Paris and London, obelisks were raised in city squares. In music halls, songs were written about Cleopatra. Fashion adopted lotus motifs, jewelry gleamed with scarabs, and even the architecture of drawing rooms borrowed the shapes of pylons and columns. Museums filled with mummies and sarcophagi, each relic displayed under glass as curious visitors whispered of curses and eternity. But beneath this fascination was something deeper, a genuine desire to understand. Scholars began to decipher the language of the ancients, piecing together the riddle of hieroglyphs thanks to the Rosetta Stone. For the first time in millennia, the words of the pharaohs could be read once more. Their voices, though lost to silence, spoke again of offerings, of journeys to the underworld, of prayers to Ra, Isis, and Osiris. The age of the pharaohs was reawakening, not in Egypt alone but across the world. As this rebirth unfolded, the Valley of Kings itself became a place of pilgrimage for archaeologists and dreamers alike. Picture the early explorers making their way up the barren cliffs, the desert sun pressing down upon their shoulders, the sand crunching beneath their boots. They brought with them picks and spades, ropes and baskets, their eyes alight with the thought of what lay beneath. Some searched for gold, others for knowledge, but all were drawn by the same invisible thread, the promise that somewhere beneath the stone, the pharaohs still waited. One by one, tombs were rediscovered. The tomb of Seti I, with its dazzling painted corridors stretching deep into the rock, left visitors in awe. The tomb of Ramses VI revealed ceilings painted with constellations, the stars of eternity shining in vivid blue above the sarcophagus chamber. These were not ruins, they were living art, breathing stillness and power after thousands of years. The names of forgotten kings once again entered human speech, their faces gazed upon in flickering lamplight as though they had only just departed. And then, of course, came the greatest rebirth of all, the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. Howard Carter's candlelight moment, peering into the sealed chamber and declaring that he saw wonderful things, was not just the opening of a tomb. It was the opening of a new chapter in humanity's relationship with the past. For Tutankhamun was not a mighty conqueror like Ramses, nor a builder of empires like Thutmose. He was a boy king, scarcely more than a youth, whose reign had been brief and fragile. And yet his tomb, sealed and nearly forgotten, contained treasures beyond imagination. The world gasped. Newspapers across continents blazed with headlines. Images of the golden mask spread like wildfire, its serene, youthful face staring into countless pairs of modern eyes. In that moment, Tutankhamun became more than a pharaoh, he became the embodiment of Egypt reborn. Through him, the age of the pharaohs came alive once again, not as dust and ruin but as radiant, golden splendor. Museums overflowed with visitors, people queuing for hours just to catch a glimpse of a statue, a jewel, a shard of painted wood. Egypt, once thought of as a land of mystery and silence, became a living presence in the modern imagination. The pharaohs were alive again not in their bodies, but in the fascination they inspired. Think of how powerful this rebirth was. A civilization that had ended thousands of years before the birth of Christ, a culture buried by sand and forgotten by time, rose again in the hearts of millions. Poets wrote verses of Nile sunsets, painters captured lotus blossoms and temple walls, filmmakers spun stories of mummies and curses. The ancient became eternal, breathing through the imaginations of those who had never set foot upon Egyptian soil. And yet, amid the excitement and spectacle, there was always the hush of reverence. To step into the Valley of Kings even as a modern archaeologist was to enter a place set apart. The stillness lingered, the silence pressed close. The golden mask may gleam beneath glass in Cairo, but the chambers where it once lay remain filled with whispers. The walls, painted with gods and stars, still glow faintly in the torchlight. It is as if the pharaohs allow us a glimpse, but not possession. Their eternity is theirs alone, no matter how much we peer into their world. The age of the pharaohs was reborn not just in museums or books, but in something deeper, in the recognition that time cannot truly erase memory. That what is carved with devotion, what is painted with belief, what is sung in prayer, can endure across thousands of years. We live in steel and glass, yet we still pause before the face of Tutankhamun and feel awe. We still whisper the name of Ramses, or Cleopatra, or Nefertari, and sense the echo of greatness. So the Valley of Kings is not dead. It is alive, carried into each age anew, reborn in the wonder of those who discover it. For every child who dreams of pyramids, for every scholar who bends over a hieroglyphic inscription, for every traveler who gazes upon the Nile at dusk, Egypt breathes again. The pharaohs rise once more, not in flesh, but in memory, in imagination, in the eternal rebirth of human curiosity. Let us linger in that thought, here in the cool silence of the valley. The cliffs rise high above us, their golden faces kissed by the fading sun. The desert wind sighs through the hollows. And beneath the rock, the pharaohs rest still, their dreams entwined with ours. Time bends, and for a moment, we stand not in the present, nor in the past, but in the eternal age of the pharaohs, an age reborn whenever their names are spoken, whenever their treasures gleam, whenever their stories are told beneath the stars. Guardians of Eternity. The Valley of Kings, though hidden by desert cliffs and veiled in silence, was never meant to be merely a resting place. It was a fortress, a realm between worlds, where the living labored to preserve the dead and to shield them from intrusion. The pharaohs, whose crowns once gleamed in sunlight and whose voices once commanded armies, sought in death not oblivion but eternity. And to guard that eternity, priests and architects, scribes and sculptors, devised a web of protection, some carved in stone, others whispered in spells, and still others left only as shadows of fear. Step with me now into that hidden labyrinth. Imagine the moment when a tomb was sealed, the sarcophagus lowered, the treasures set in order, the painted walls alive with images of gods and stars. Torches flickered, chants rose in the burial chamber, and priests in linen robes intoned prayers older than memory itself. These were not mere rituals, they were acts of guardianship. Each hieroglyph carved into the walls was a spell, each offering a safeguard, each symbol a key meant to guide the pharaoh's soul to the afterlife and shield his body from harm. The priests were the first guardians. They alone held the knowledge of the spells, the precise order of the rites, the sacred intonations of words that bridged living and the dead. With solemn voices they invoked Osiris, lord of the underworld, and Anubis, the jackal-headed guide of souls. They painted spells upon the tomb walls, written not for mortal eyes but for divine ones, maps of the underworld, instructions for passing through gates, passwords to appease the guardians of the night. The tomb was transformed into a cosmos, a miniature universe in which the pharaoh could journey, safe and armed, through all perils of the afterlife. But not all dangers came from the spirit world. The living, too, posed threats. Even in ancient days, men coveted gold. To guard against plunderers, tomb builders designed intricate passageways, shafts that plunged into the rock, corridors that twisted and turned, false doors and hidden chambers meant to confound intruders. Some tombs had concealed entrances, their outlines erased from the cliff face, blending into the desert as though the mountain itself had swallowed the king. Others were sealed with colossal stones, fitted so tightly that only the strongest tools and greatest patience could move them. Yet even such protections could not always withstand human greed. And so there came another line of defense, one not of stone, but of fear. Curses. Carved into lintels, inscribed upon stelae, whispered in rumors that spread among villagers, these curses warned of swift and terrible fates for those who disturbed the eternal sleep of a king. Some promised death by crocodile or serpent, others blindness, sterility, or madness. The words were meant not only to frighten but to invoke the gods themselves as guardians. The pharaoh's tomb was sacred ground. To violate it was not merely theft but blasphemy, a crime against eternity itself. It is said that in the tomb of Kentika Ikeki, a nobleman of the Old Kingdom, there were inscribed words warning. As for any man who shall enter my tomb in impurity, I shall seize him like a wild bird, I shall drag his neck like a goose. In later centuries, warnings grew even sharper, death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the pharaoh. Whether carved by priests or whispered by villagers, such words lingered in the imagination, spreading the belief that the dead themselves could avenge their rest. Were these curses real, in the sense of summoning divine wrath? Or were they, perhaps, a kind of psychological trap, meant to sow dread in the hearts of would-be robbers? The truth may never be known. But what is clear is that the fear they inspired was enduring. When Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb, and when strange deaths soon followed, the world revived the old whispers, the curse had struck again. The modern age, with its electric lamps and automobiles, still shivered at words first carved 3,000 years before. But perhaps the greatest guardians were not curses or priests, but time itself. The desert, with its unyielding sun and drifting sands, became both enemy and protector. It swallowed entrances, collapsed shafts, and buried walls beneath dunes. Tombs were hidden not only by design but by accident, erased from memory, their very existence forgotten. And in that forgetting, they endured. For centuries, no hand touched them, no torch burned within them, no thief disturbed their chambers. The sands of Egypt, relentless and patient, preserved the pharaohs more faithfully than any wall of stone. And yet, guardianship was not only about keeping the tomb safe. It was also about ensuring the pharaoh's eternal journey. For the Egyptians believed that a king was not truly alive in the afterlife unless his name was remembered, unless prayers were spoken for him, unless his image endured. To forget was to die a second death. Thus, the guardianship extended into the living world. Priests in temples chanted the king's name in daily rituals long after his burial. Offerings were left, incense burned, hymns sung. Memory itself became a guardian, for as long as the name of the pharaoh was spoken, his eternity was secure. Even the very artistry of the tomb, the paintings of gods, the carvings of hieroglyphs, the statues of guardians placed beside sarcophagi was an act of eternal protection. Each image was more than decoration, it was alive with sacred purpose. The painted figure of Anubis was not a mere image, but Anubis himself, watching with jackal eyes from the darkness. The winged goddess Maat was not pigment on plaster, but truth and order embodied, spreading her wings to shield the king's soul. The statues of soldiers and servants were more than stone, they were eternal protectors, ready to rise in spirit if danger approached. So when we think of the Valley of Kings, we must not see only tombs. We must see fortresses of belief, palaces of eternity, guarded by stone and sand, by gods and curses, by memory and fear. Each tomb was a world in itself, designed to withstand not just centuries but millennia. And in many ways, they succeeded. For here we are, thousands of years later, still whispering the names of Tutankhamun, Ramses, Seti. Still marveling at the guardianship that has carried them into our age. Close your eyes and listen. Do you hear it? The hush of desert wind, the faint echo of chanting, the scrape of stone being sealed. Somewhere deep within the mountain, torches are being extinguished. The priests step back into the corridor, their work complete. The tomb is sealed, the pharaoh sleeps, and the guardians take their watch. They have kept it for thousands of years, and will keep it for thousands more. For in Egypt, eternity is never lost, it is only waiting. The voices of stone. Stone remembers what men forget. In the deserts of Egypt, beneath the burning sun and across the banks of the Nile, voices were carved into rock, pressed into walls, raised in obelisks that pointed, like fingers toward eternity. When kings passed into the afterlife and priests finished their chants, when tomb doors closed and sand swallowed paths, the stone endured. Silent, yet speaking. Lifeless, yet alive with meaning. For in Egypt, stone itself became a guardian, holding the names, faces, and destinies of pharaohs against the erosion of time. The Valley of the Kings, sacred and secret, was but one side of this eternal guardianship. On the other side stood the temple's massive, immovable sanctuaries of devotion, carved with hieroglyphs that told not only of gods and myths but of the very lives of rulers. Imagine walking into Karnak, the largest temple complex ever built, where rows of colossal columns rise like a petrified forest. Each surface is alive with inscriptions, victories of kings, offerings to gods, praises sung to Ammon-Ra. The stone does not whisper here, it sings. Every chiseled line is a proclamation, every relief an oath. The king has lived, the king has ruled, the king is eternal. These hieroglyphs, the words of the gods, were not written only for mortals. They were carved as spells to outlast flesh, to keep memory alive not just among people, but in the eternal order of the cosmos. For the Egyptians believed that to inscribe was to preserve, to carve was to conjure permanence. As long as the hieroglyph remained, so too did the truth it carried. A name carved into a wall was a name alive, a story etched into a temple was a story unending. Walk now through the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari, rising like a staircase against the cliffs. Its terraces bear images of expeditions to the land of Punt, of gifts brought back across the sea, myrrh trees, gold, incense. To look upon them is to hear Hatshepsut's reign speaking still, a voice beyond death. The temple itself has become her guardian, proclaiming her story even when her successors tried to erase her memory. Chisels were taken to her images, her cartouches hacked away. Yet still, the stone remembers. Even in silence, even in damage, her presence lingers. The monument is her voice, echoing across the centuries. The same is true of Ramses II, whose temples at Abu Simbel stand like colossal guardians of his legacy. Four-seated statues of the king, each towering as high as a mountain cliff, stare out over the Nile's waters. They are not statues alone, they are proclamations of power, guardians of memory, voices of stone that say, I was here. I reigned. I shall not be forgotten. When sunlight falls directly into the inner sanctuary twice each year illuminating the statues of the gods and the king himself, it is as though the stone itself breathes, affirming Ramses' eternal place among divinities. Even obelisks, those needle-like shafts of granite that once stood at temple gates, were voices of stone, inscriptions of devotion and power. To stand before them was to read not only the king's name, but his cosmic role. Many of these obelisks were carried away in later centuries to Rome, to Paris, to London, to New York. Yet wherever they stand, they still speak, their hieroglyphs proclaiming the eternal kingship of those long gone. Hieroglyphs themselves were guardians. They were more than writing, they were sacred breaths made visible. Each sign was alive, carrying a force that could sustain or protect. When carved into tombs, they were spells against oblivion. When inscribed in temples, they were promises to gods. And when etched into stele, they were voices meant to speak to the people, to remind them of the greatness of their rulers. To erase a hieroglyph, especially the name of a king, was an act of destruction as final as death itself. For without a name, without words, the spirit could no longer endure. Consider Akhenaten, the pharaoh who defied tradition by turning devotion to the Aten, the sun disk. After his death, successors attempted to erase him entirely. His name was hacked from stone, his images obliterated, his city abandoned. Yet fragments remain, broken reliefs, buried statues, half-erased cartouches. Even in ruins, the stone resists silence. It continues to speak, whispering of a king who tried to change eternity itself. And then there is Tutankhamun. Though his tomb lay hidden, his voice lived on in the fragments of stone scattered across temples. At Karnak, at Luxor, his name can still be found, a boy king offering incense, a child pharaoh raising his hand to the gods. Though his reign was short, and though his memory was nearly lost, the stone held fast. When his tomb was found, it was not only the treasures that stunned the world, but the realization that the boy king had been remembered after all through the guardianship of stone, waiting to rejoin his story. But stone was more than guardian of kings, it was also storyteller of people. Reliefs depict workers hauling blocks, scribes recording harvests, soldiers marching into battle. The walls tell of floods and festivals, of offerings and prayers, of joys and fears. In their carvings, one can see laughter and grief, triumph and struggle. The pharaohs may have commanded the monuments, but the stone captured the lives of all who built them. Each chisel mark is a memory, each carved figure a voice. And so, when we walk among the ruins today, we are not alone. We are surrounded by voices. They rise from the walls of Karnak, they echo in the colonnades of Luxor, they linger in the hieroglyphs of Saqqara. They tell us stories that kings wish to be eternal, but they also tell us stories the kings never intended, truths that slip through the cracks, whispers preserved despite erasure. Stone remembers. The desert wind passes through colonnades, and sunlight falls on inscriptions older than empires. In the silence, you may almost hear it, the murmur of voices carved into eternity. The pharaohs are gone, their courts dissolved, their empires dust. Yet still the stone speaks. Still it guards. Still it remembers. For in Egypt, eternity was never silence. It was a memory. It was an inscription. It was the enduring voice of stone. The sands of time. The desert has no mercy, and yet it is the greatest protector Egypt has ever known. Its breath is hot and dry, its winds harsh and relentless, its horizons endless and indifferent. And yet, in that silence, in that lifelessness, it has preserved what rain, forest, and ocean would have devoured. The sands have swallowed temples whole, buried cities, and sealed tombs. But in doing so, they kept them safe. The desert destroys and the desert guards. It is the eternal paradox of Egypt. The very force that erodes is also the force that conserves. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of the Valley of the Kings. The cliffs rise like sentinels, sheer walls of limestone glowing orange beneath the sun. The air is sharp, empty of moisture, heavy with heat. Not a tree, not a bird, not a ripple of water breaks the silence. Only the shifting of sand, the faintest whisper of wind, moves through this valley. And beneath your feet, within the stone, beneath the dunes, lie worlds' painted chambers, golden coffins, stories etched in color and light that have been waiting thousands of years to be seen again. It is here that time and desert strike their bargain. The dryness of the air has kept wood from rotting, has preserved linen, and has kept pigments vibrant. Walls painted in the days of Ramses still shine with blues and reds, papyrus scrolls, delicate as autumn leaves, survive in sealed jars. The desert, in all its desolation, becomes the archivist of history. Where rain would have washed paint away, where dampness would have rotted coffins, where lushness would have consumed paper and cloth, here nothing changes. Death keeps life. Silence guards sound. But the desert is not always gentle. Its sandstorms cut like knives, erasing inscriptions, stripping statues, burying avenues once alive with festivals. The great Sphinx itself was swallowed again and again, its massive body hidden beneath drifts of golden sand until only its face remained, staring across the Nile with unblinking eyes. For centuries, it was buried almost to its neck, forgotten, beneath the desert floor until archaeologists brushed its outlines into light once more. Without the sands, it would have vanished without a trace. Because of the sands, it still whispers its story. The tombs of the pharaohs themselves tell this paradox most clearly. Each was carved deep into stone, sealed with plaster, hidden behind rubble. Yet the desert was not always kind. Shifting sands revealed entrances, floods of rare desert rains washed through cracks, time and pressure collapsed ceilings. In some tombs, wood rotted after all, paintings faded, treasures disappeared to thieves. And yet, just next door, other tombs lay untouched for millennia, sealed so well that when opened, the colors on the walls seemed painted only yesterday. Tutankhamun's tomb was one such gift of the desert. Not because the sands were gentle, but because they buried him so thoroughly that chance, weather, and robbers all passed him by. The desert also has its own memory. The dunes move, but slowly, steadily, always reshaping. Ancient roads once connected quarries to temples, caravans to cities. But the desert covered them, erased the footprints, and made the paths vanish. Centuries later, archaeologists find faint traces of wheel ruts fossilized in stone, a line of cairns half-buried, fragments of pottery scattered in silence. The sands destroy the surface, but beneath, they keep secrets. The desert is not forgetful. It is selective. Think of the pyramids at Giza. For thousands of years, they have stood, their stones heated by the sun, cooled by desert nights, battered by wind and sand. The limestone casing has long since been stripped, either by time or by human hands, but the core remains. Why? Because they were built in stone, in the heart of the desert, where no forest would topple them, no storms would level them. Even as civilizations rose and fell, as the Nile changed course, as empires came and went, the sands kept them company. Silent, eternal, guardians of guardians. And yet, the desert is also cruel. It has devoured countless names. Temples once dedicated to forgotten gods now lie broken, their inscriptions erased by wind-blown grit. Small shrines to local deities, once vibrant with offerings, are gone, swallowed completely. Without discovery, without excavation, they remain silent, unremembered. For every Karnak that still sings, when Carter brushed sand from the steps leading down into Tutankhamun's tomb, he was not just uncovering stone. He was peeling back the desert's veil. He was asking the sands to surrender one of their secrets. And the sands, for reasons unknown, allowed it. How many more secrets lie buried, guarded by the shifting dunes, waiting for the patient hand that will brush them back into light? As the desert sun sets over the Valley of the Kings, the cliffs glow like embers. Shadows lengthen, silence deepens, and the sands grow cool. Night will soon cloak them, and they will resume their endless vigil. The stars rise overhead, eternal as the monuments themselves, and in their glow, the desert whispers again, I take, and I keep. I bury, and I guard. I am silence, and I am memory. I am the sands of time. And so the guardianship of Egypt continues. Not only through temples and tombs, not only through priests and curses, but through the desert itself. The sands are not empty. They are filled with memories. They are filled with voices. They are filled with all that has been, and perhaps all that is yet to be revealed. For in Egypt, the sands do not simply mark the passage of time. They are time itself. Beyond the Nile, Egypt's influence across the ancient world. Egypt has always been more than its river, more than its sands, more than its kings. From the moment stone was carved into the pyramid, from the first time hieroglyphs were etched into temple walls, Egypt became not just a nation, but a presence and echo that reached far beyond its deserts. The Nile nourished Egypt itself, but Egypt nourished the world. And so, even as we reflect on Tutankhamun and the Valley of the Kings, we must step outward, tracing how the spirit of the pharaohs, the art of the tombs, the wisdom of the priests, and the vision of eternity seeped beyond Egypt's borders and shaped the ancient world. Imagine the Nile at flood, swelling and spilling into fields, painting the land green, feeding a people who would become the first great civilization of continuity. Other lands looked on in wonder. Traders, travelers, emissaries, and conquerors came and went carrying with them impressions of Egypt's temples, Egypt's gold, Egypt's mysteries. And as they returned to their homes, they carried Egypt itself with them, transformed into new traditions, new gods, new dreams. The influence of the Nile became a river flowing outward into the Mediterranean, into the Near East, into Africa, into the imagination of all who encountered it. Take, for instance, the Greeks. Long before Alexander the Great ever dreamed of conquest, Greeks traveled to Egypt's shores. They came seeking wisdom, echoed Osiris, that Hermes shared something with Thoth. Philosophers like Pythagoras and Plato were said to have drawn knowledge from Egyptian priests, learning geometry, cosmology, and the mysteries of the soul. Even Herodotus, the so-called father of history, wrote in awe of Egypt, declaring it the gift of the Nile and describing its temples and rituals with fascination. And yet, the exchange was not one-sided. Egypt absorbed as much as it gave. Greek settlers, particularly in the later centuries, brought their own styles, their own words, their own gods. The blending of cultures in cities like Naucratis foreshadowed what would one day happen on a grander scale under Alexander and the Ptolemies. Egypt became a mirror for Greece, and Greece a mirror for Egypt, their identities reflecting, bending, reshaping. Out of this exchange came the seeds of Hellenistic Egypt, where Cleopatra would one day rule a queen both Egyptian and Greek. Farther east, Egypt's influence seeped into the empires of Mesopotamia and beyond. The Babylonians and Assyrians coveted Egypt's wealth, its prestige, its gold. To conquer Egypt was to conquer not merely a land, but a legend. And so they came, armies sweeping into the Nile Delta, only to retreat, only to return. Each encounter left its mark. Egyptian artistry traveled east, Egyptian gods were noted, Egyptian luxuries desired. Lapis, ivory, and gold were not just commodities, but symbols of the pharaoh's might, sought after in distant palaces. In the south, Nubia was Egypt's neighbor, rival, and sometimes conqueror. The Nubians absorbed Egypt's gods, built pyramids of their own, wrote in Egyptian hieroglyphs, and adorned their kings as pharaohs. The black granite statues of Nubian rulers still stand in museums, their forms unmistakably Egyptian yet also uniquely African. The Nile flowed both ways south to north, north to south, carrying culture, carrying influence, carrying memory. The Kushite kings of Nubia did not merely imitate Egypt. For a time, they became Egypt, ruling as its 25th dynasty, reminding us that influence is not always gentle, but sometimes absolute. And in the west, across deserts, Egypt's stories traveled into North Africa, into Libya, into the lands of Berbers and traders. The caravan routes were slow, but they carried whispers, of golden tombs, of priests who could read the stars, of gods with falcon heads and jackal faces. Egypt became part of the lore of peoples who had never seen its pyramids, who had never walked its temples, but who believed it was a land of magic at the edge of the known world. Even in the Holy Lands, Egypt's presence was unavoidable. Biblical stories tell of Joseph rising in Pharaoh's court, of Moses leading his people from bondage, of plagues and miracles unfolding a nation among nations, but as a stage upon which divine destinies played out. Egypt became eternal, not just through monuments, but through scripture itself. And what of Rome, that hungry empire that would one day take Egypt into its grasp? Rome revered Egypt long before it conquered it. Roman generals and emperors collected Egyptian statues, built obelisks in their cities, adopted Isis as a goddess worshipped far from the Nile. Cleopatra herself became as much a Roman symbol as an Egyptian one, her life and her death shaping the politics of Caesar and Antony, of Augustus and the empire's birth. When Rome at last claimed Egypt, it was not simply territory they absorbed, it was a world of myth, a land of eternal allure, a culture so deep it seeped into Rome's veins forever. Even beyond empire and conquest, Egypt's influence was subtler, softer, but just as enduring. The very idea of the afterlife, so central to Egyptian thought, rippled outward. The weighing of the heart, the journey through darkness, the promise of eternal fields of peace, these became echoes in Greek philosophy, in Jewish mysticism, in Christian visions of heaven and hell. The pyramids, the tombs, the rituals, they were not just practices of a single person, but seeds planted in the soil of human imagination itself. Tutankhamun's story, when uncovered, renewed this influence in the modern age. His golden mask became a symbol not only of ancient Egypt, but of beauty, of mystery, of timelessness. Exhibitions of his treasures circled the globe, drawing millions, inspiring art, jewelry, literature, even fashion. In Paris, in London, in New York, people who had never seen Egypt with their own eyes felt touched by it, moved by it, changed by it. The boy king became the ambassador of an influence that had begun thousands of years earlier. And so, beyond the Nile, Egypt's echo is endless. It is in the stones of Greece, in the laws of Rome, in the myths of Israel, in the faith of billions, in the dreams of artists, in the visions of philosophers. The desert may have buried tombs, but it could not bury ideas. Those escaped on ships, on scrolls, on songs, on whispers. The Nile gave birth to Egypt, but Egypt gave birth to part of civilization itself. Now, as we stand at this point in our story, the boy king Tutankhamun feels less like a single figure, and more like a doorway into that echo. Through him, we glimpse not only his tomb and his treasures, but the way Egypt seeped into the bones of the world. The eternal light of Tutankhamun. The story of Tutankhamun is not only about discovery, or treasure, or even the whispers of a curse. It is about memory. About the way a life, long ended, can ripple outward into centuries beyond imagining. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the Valley of the Kings under the quiet night sky. The stars drift above, the cliffs stand in shadow, and beneath the sands a boy king still rests. Once he had forgotten a name buried in silence. But now, his golden mask gazes out across the world, a symbol of Egypt's timeless voice. We have walked through temples and tombs. We have stood beside torches and shadows. We have listened to whispers of priests and of sand. And yet, all along, the rhythm has been gentle. For Tutankhamun's story is not one of fear, but of eternity. The curse may fade into legend. The gold may sleep behind glass. But the dream of Egypt, the dream of life unending. The dream of youth forever shining in the afterlife. That dream is still alive in us. As the desert wind hushes. As the last grains of sand settle into stillness. The boy king sleeps on. Not in darkness, but in a golden light that never fades. And perhaps, as you drift into rest, you too will hear it. The echo of ancient songs. The soft brush of eternity against your soul. The quiet promise that memory itself is a kind of immortality. The story closes, but the river of Egypt flows on. And like the Nile, it always returns. Sleep now, gently. The king and his treasures are at peace. And so are you.